Now we're going to start adding some of the lighter hairs. This is I'm using a 276 buff, which is a cream color. I'm using one of the 4 sharp edges to start slowly adding these final hairs. You can see that I rotate my pastel as it gets dull so that I can add more sharp, pretty hairs, pulling them out into the background. I take my time, carefully add them, judge where I want them to go. Changing the angle of my hand so that I can get those long hairs on Oscar's ears pulled out. Just take your time when you do this so you can get the look that you're looking for. Making hair takes time. Now I'm going to use my 211 white, checking the edges there, and add the white along the tips of the cream colored hairs as I pull them out into the background. I'm always careful to draw my hair in the direction that the fur grows. Now this is the 204 or 203, excuse me, burnt sienna. I'm adding some red hair, which is just a little bit lighter than the dark brown we used in the final layers yesterday. Back to the 276, checking the ends. So I turn my stick over. I often do that. I sharpen both ends of the stick and then I can use both ends. This is the 204 or 203, excuse me. To 63 Indian red, adding some dark hairs in between the light ones, which is something you can do. You can go back and add darker hairs in between the light hairs as you go along. Back to the 211 white. Now I've noticed that I need to get the background close into the hairs. So I'm using the 305 Spruce Blue New Pastel to add background color right up into the hairs on the dog. So remember when I told you that we worked as close as we could with the background. Now with the Spruce Blue we can bring it right up into the hairs so that there are no gaps. So I can draw that dark hair in between the light hairs that I just put in. Now I'm going to use my white charcoal pencil to pull out the little wispy hairs out into the background. This really adds the finishing touch to your fur. So I'm just carefully pulling some of those out, a few fine lines out into the fur. Now I'm going to speed things up a bit for you as I finish adding fur to this ear. So I've speeded things up a bit. I'm continuing to add the fur. I'm using more of a zigzag motion and shorter strokes because the hair is shorter in this area on the forehead than it is on the ears. So I'm adding back in, I'm using the cocoa brown, which is a nice warm brown. The 253, we used it in the eyes. It's a very nice brown color. It works well in here. It's lighter than some of the darker browns. And then back to the 276. Now I'm using a Conte pencil. This is a number 47. It is almost the exact same color as our 276 buff. And I'm using it to add some light hairs. I think this is a nice addition to the project. I do like to use Conte pencils, not for everything, but if you like pencil, this will work really well for you in this project. So I'm drawing in a few hairs. It's not quite as bright as the buff, so it kind of acts as a middle value, a go-between. It's very nice around the eyes here. You can see how it's just not quite as bright as the buff. So now I'm going to go back with a lighter pastel, the buff, the 276, and add a few lighter hairs in between the ones that I put down with the Conte pencil. So they work together and create a really nice fur texture. You can see I'm very careful about how I add them. Very precise as I can be. I'm going to use the Conte pencil again to pull some buff colored hairs out into the background. I use the pencil at an angle to my paper. If you're having trouble getting the sharp lines that you want with a pastel stick, this will help you a lot. And back to the buff to get a few brighter hairs. With the 203 burnt sienna to add the little hairs on the top of Oscar's head. You can see I use a zigzag motion. I'm not so concerned with sharpness on the edges. They can get a little dull. This is kind of the undercoat hairs before I add the sharper, lighter hairs on top. I like this color. It's a nice red color. I'm going to go back to the 263, which is a little darker. Pull some of those little dark hairs up into the background. So I've turned it over to use the sharper edge rather than the point to add those little hairs in. And continuing to add the little hairs with my 263. And now I'm going to use another Conte pencil. This is a number 17, which is a little bit lighter than the brown hairs I put in, but I'm able to go over top and add some lighter hairs into that. If you can, add a Conte pencils to your budget if they fit in there and you want to add them to your list of pastel supplies. They're a wonderful addition. So now I'm using the 47 again to add lighter hairs back into the dog's coat. I'm going to speed things up a little bit now as I add a few more colors onto the forehead of the dog. So I'm switching back and forth between my lighter buff color. This is the 263 Indian red, adding up in the center. It's darker in the center of his forehead, so we'll add a darker color there. So I'm just zigzagging color in down around his nose, not using the pointy end to kind of go carefully around that area. Now I'm adding the Cordovan, the 353. I'm darkening around the eyes and along the side of the muzzle. So I'm just shading that in, not really drawing hairs, just adding color. Now I'm using the 203, and now back to the 263. I'll slow this down to real time so you can see how slowly and how carefully I place these hairs. So now I'm starting to work on the other ear, so I'm drawing the hairs a little more carefully. A little more, a little sharper. So 203. It adds a little more red tone. This dog is very red, so that's why I keep adding more red color back in there to match the colors of his fur. This is the 263. You can see it's darker. So I'm making it quite a bit darker on the side of his forehead, which develops the form of the dog's head. Really like the way this is looking. I'm switching back again to the redder one. The 203 Burnt Sienna. Now I'm using a purpley color. This is number 5 in a Conte pencil. I wanted to see if I like that, and I do. It adds some color into the shadows. So I think this would be a good addition to our color palette to put it into the shadows. So be sure and try that. Back to the 263. I'm going to speed things up a little bit. As you can see me work back and forth between the 263 and some of the other colors. So now we're back to real time and back to the buff, 276, NuPastel. Starting to draw in those delicate little hairs around the eye. They're short, and the hair around the eye goes in a multitude of different directions as it grows up the muzzle of the dog, and then it grows up and it grows around as well, and the hair grows out of the eyes into the muzzle hair grows into the hair around the eyes. So be very careful when you're adding your hairs that they go in the direction that the hair grows on the animal that you're painting. Now I'm going to use my Conte pencil, number 47. Add some hairs into the area I just worked down on the lower side of the face. These are very nice. This color is really wonderful for adding those lighter hairs that grow there without being too distinct and too bright. Switching back to 276, adding a few brighter hairs. Now I'm always comparing what I'm doing to my reference photo, which is right off the screen here, but it's very important to have a good reference photo to work from when you're painting animals. If you're doing portraits or thinking about doing dog portraits or pet portraits, be sure and get good reference photos. So now moving over to the other eye. Shaping the side of his face with the way that the hair grows. Short little hairs, carefully putting them in, and see, you can see it just we've developed the side of Oscar's face. I'll switch back to my Conte pencil. And draw those hairs down from his eye. Now I'm going to use my white to add a few brighter hairs around the eye. Little short hairs. I'm going to use it also on the other side. And get those few bright hairs above the eye too. And now I'm going to use my 6B charcoal pencils and pull little tiny black hairs down from the eyelid and out from the eyelid, as the case above the eye, into the hair. Because sometimes while adding the little white hairs, it kind of overlaps the eyelid. And this helps the eye to sit back down in that hair. So I always do this. I make sure my pencil is very sharp. Look how pretty that looks. Continuing to add more brown hair with the 203, softening it a little bit with my finger, and a few white hairs. Now I'm going to use a Conte brown pencil, number 31. I think it needs to be a little bit darker in here, so I'm going to draw in some darker hairs. If things get to be a little too bright, then you can add in some other colors. This works really nice. So I'm continuing to use the brown pencil back and forth to integrate the different colors together, and now the number 47 pencil. Just take your time when you're doing this. So I want to make this area darker, so I'm using the pencil to add browner color. Now this is a really nice little trick here. I'm using my graphite pencil to go over these brighter hairs that are right here that curve down into the bottom of the cheek. And I can use this to gray down the hairs just enough without adding a lot of color. It is a very handy tool. And I use that quite often in a painting. And so now I'm going back to the Conte pencil number 47. Now this is a light gray NuPastel, number 299. I'm adding the hair. I don't want to add white hair right now on the muzzle of the dog, so I'm adding gray hair. The white hair would be too bright. So I'm using the 299 gray to add those hairs. Taking my time. This is in real time. I'm continuing to add hairs as they grow up the muzzle in the center. Short little hairs. You don't have to fill in every spot on the dog. As you can see, I'm letting the browns and the reds show through. It's important to get the direction right. I'm going very slow, adding them one by one. Now I'm going to take that same gray and add the hairs around the nose and on the muzzle of the dog. He has a lot of white hairs in his muzzle, and that's why we put the gray undercoat in. And now we're going to put light gray hairs. They're short. We're going to go all the way around. This is the corner of his mouth. Now I'm using my black NuPastel. I had colored over the edge a little bit and lost it, so I had to put it back in with the NuPastel black. So I'm back to adding gray hair, coming around the nose. And now under his lip on his little chin. Now I'm using my white charcoal pencil to add a few hairs, random hairs. Now I'm using the Spruce Blue, the 305, to add the blue background closer up to the left side of Oscar's fur. And now we're using the Cocoa Brown, the 253, to bring out the brown color to meet the background. I chose a blue color for Oscar's background because it's a natural complement for the orange that's in his fur. It looks very nice. It makes a very nice background for Oscar. So that's the end of part 3. Please join me for part 4.